only way or the best way of doing evaluation? And the answer is, it depends. So let me go on. So let me give you some examples. Conditional cash transfers in Mexico originally during the Progressive program. Some villages got conditional cash transfers, some did not. And there were better average outcomes. The conditional cash transfer was the family got some money, but instead of it being you just got the money, you only got the money if your kid went to the clinic and was checked and got their shots, or the kid went to school, or whatever the nature of the program was. This meant that in this evaluation, there was better average outcomes for the treatment villages, and the random selection means it must have been the conditional cash transfer, not something else, because there wasn't anything else going on. So let me take that as given, though in fact, well, let me take that as given. The question is, what do we learn? So there's the immediate question is, the fact that it worked in Mexico, does that tell us that it would work in India? Well, there's obviously a big number of steps. And that's what is often described as the problem of external validity. But there's also the question of whether it would actually work for a specific village in Mexico. So we know it worked for the average village in Mexico, but it certainly didn't work for all the villages. Now, would it work for some particular village you're interested in? So for instance, if the village were voting on whether to have conditional cash transfers, should the village vote to do so based on this result? That's not clear either. How about the question of why did it work? And if we knew why it worked, what was it that made it work, we could probably answer the first two questions. Another peculiar thing about Progressa was that the villages that didn't get the treatment knew they were going to get it 2 years later. So that's a very special sort of control group. And it's not necessarily the same as having it or not having it. Does that matter? Another thing that's a big important thing, and I'll come back to this over and over again, is Mexico had a system of clinics. So the clinics were there if the parents wanted to take their kids to the clinics. Now, you'll laugh at me when I say this, but it's actually really important. If you've given people conditional cash transfers and there were no clinics, the program couldn't possibly have worked, right? So there's a crucial ingredient in this trial, which is that the clinics were there. Now, Santiago Levy, who played a big part in Progressa in Mexico and is now at the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington, says that he spends much of his life today fighting off countries that want to copy the Progressive scheme because he knows it's not going to work there because there are no clinics or because there aren't the schools or something. And yet, we're in a world in which, you know, rigorous analysis has shown that conditional cash transfers work. So that result gets transplanted into some sort of magic mantra, which is supposed to apply everywhere. And of course it doesn't, because there's an obvious thing missing in some countries, which is like clinics. So you've got to ask yourself, are these things transferable? What about dams? Well, it's not really possible to do randomized dam construction. Though you can actually amuse yourself when you're trying to fall asleep at night by thinking about randomly constructing dams all over India. You drop a pin on Google Maps and you build a dam there, and then you see, well, of course you wouldn't, but that makes an important point, which is there's lots of important policy questions that cannot be evaluated in this way. So if you stick to RCTs, there's whole areas of policy, not just dams, macroeconomic policy, and so on, which we just really don't have anything to say by using these methods. Some have argued that policy should not be implemented in those cases, which is an extreme prescription. And in fact, if you think about that, we do many things routinely for which there have been no randomized controlled trials. You sometimes, the people who advocate these things very rigorously say, knowledge is not possible without randomized controlled trials. You sort of wonder how they get out of bed in the morning. They say, you say to your spouse, could you do a randomized controlled trial to make sure that toilets are working in the bathroom? Anyway, you can see there's a lot of things we know. We take aspirins all the time. There have never been a randomized controlled trials for aspirin. I have an artificial hip. There's never been a randomized controlled trial for an artificial hip. There's just a huge number of things which we depend on that have never been evaluated this way. So there are other ways of doing this. Rahimi Pandey and Esther Duflo have a paper on dams, which use the placement of dams together with the NSS data. Dean Spears, who I talked about earlier, has worked on the total sanitation campaign using the NFH and other survey data. And these alternative methods also estimate average treatment effects, and they're what are called observational studies, and they're weaker than randomized controlled trials in some respects, because after all, there's now no guarantee of causality. You have to worry about selection and bias and all the usual sort of things, so you have to argue those. And you know, it's sometimes hard to persuade people, and of course you have to make more assumptions. But there are other respects in which they're stronger, which is you can look at the distribution of treatment effects. You can recognize the fact that different dams might have different effects, and you can model that and look at it. Usually, these methods use very big national surveys, or they often do, as opposed to the very small samples that are often in trials. With different surveys, you can triangulate some question and get similar or different answers. And RCTs are very good at saying what happened, but they're not very good at saying why it happened. And these other methods often offer possibilities for inquiring into why things happen. Let me talk a little bit about small randomized controlled trials. A lot of these trials are done on very small samples. So there may be 10 villages in the controls and 10 villages in the experimentals. These trials are expensive to do, so this is not just a matter that is easily fixed. And I don't want to get technical here, but there's some deep statistical problems involved in comparing the means when you're using quite small samples. And what really happens here is that if you have individuals in your trial for whom the treatment effects are unusually large, then they can wreak havoc with your results. One example might be in microfinance. I mean, I was talking about this with Rahimi Pandey the other night, and she said, well, often in these microfinance cases, what happens is there are one or two women in the group who are actually very talented entrepreneurially. So when they get the money, they'll do amazing things with it. But for most people, you know, it's all they can do to pay the money back, sort of idea. So if you get one of these really talented women in your experimental group, it'll look like this thing's doing incredibly well. If on the other hand, that same woman is in the treatment group, it'll look like this thing is doing very badly. And it turns out you need very, very bad, very, very large samples to make that problem go away. And so what happens with a lot of these randomized controlled trials, where you've only got maybe 100 people or 100 villages, it turns out not to be nearly enough. You get lots of weird and counterintuitive results. You've no idea if this is real or whether the method is just broken. And I doubt very much that you can learn anything from a trial that has like 10 experimental and 10 controlled villages, for instance, in a caching out food experiments. Another point that's often missed is the experiment is often, indeed I'd almost always say always, conducted, it's telling me that Windows is not genuine. Yeah, I see it's buying cheap software. It's got a fake here. I'm genuine.
This is just an RCT going.
If a big notice comes up over my head saying, hey, this thing is not genuine. All right, so let's say that you were doing an experiment on a conditional cash transfer. Then you want to recruit people to be in this experiment and find out whether they would like to have their PDS cashed out for cash. You can only do this on people who agree to be in the trial. People who decided in advance they don't want anything to do with this are not in your trial. So immediately you're doing this experiment. Before you randomize, you've got a non-representative group. And that's true for nearly all trials, because you can't force people to be in trials. Occasionally you can. You can put something in the water supply or something, but usually you have to get people's permission to be in these trials. And that selects into people, and sometimes quite severely. So the people you're doing the experiment on may not be anything like the whole population. So if you do an experiment on cash transfers, and it works, it may be just because the people who agreed to play this game with you are people who think cash transfers might be a good idea. But when you actually put them into place for policy, You bring in the whole population, including people who hate this idea, and you're going to get a very different outcome. This turns out in drugs, this is really a big problem too. In the US, pharmaceuticals are tried out in randomized controlled trials, and you're typically not allowed in the trial if you've got a comorbidity, meaning there's more than one thing wrong with you at a time. Almost all older people have comorbidities. And so drug trials in the United States have very, very few old people in the trials. But nearly all drugs are consumed by old people. So you've just got this ridiculous situation that you're doing randomized controlled trials on people who are never going to consume those drugs. And it's just nuts. And a lot of people are beginning to get worried about that. The problem with this gold standard rhetoric is that if you really think RCTs are automatically best, then people don't challenge the results. And this for me is one of my big points, which is this gold standard rhetoric protects these things from this sort of routine questioning that we would almost always do on other empirical evidence. Or you might say, well, what about, okay, it turns out that Windows is indeed fake because we're frozen, which is sort of a bit of a problem. Okay. Anyone, any suggestions? Maybe that'll fix it if I do that and come back. Just now something happened. Okay, great. All right. So you might say, if small RCTs are a problem, what about doing big ones? How about enrolling all of the villages of India into an experiment on cash transfers, and then we really find out what happens and really nail it. And in fact, large social experiments like this were done in the US in the 1970s. There's a New Jersey income tax experiment, one in Seattle and Denver. Most famous, the Rand Health experiment. That Rand Health experiment, those results are still cited today and seem to be genuinely important. The other ones you never hear of at all. The problem that happens with this, and even the people who really think these are really good ideas will tell you this is a problem, which is if the government or a sponsor or a foundation puts up many millions of dollars to do one of these experiments, and you don't find anything, meaning you just get a null result, you're in deep trouble. And the sponsors will not accept that. Because the sponsors are in this to show something works. And so then what happens is they say, go away and find something. So what people do is they look through subgroups. There's two ways of doing this. You look at old people, or you look at men over the age of 50, or you look at women under the age of 15, and you look at all sorts of different groups, and they say, well, you worked for them, right? And so we've got a group, and so the policy can be applied to that group. The trouble is, you can always get there, and you can data mine until you find something, and people do. The other way you can do it is by looking for other outcomes. Originally, you were looking at people's health, maybe. So now you can look at their happiness, or you can look at their income, or you can look at whether they got divorced, or you can look at all sorts of other things. And eventually you'll find something there, too. There's a famous experiment running in the US now, an anti-poverty experiment called Moving to Opportunity. And I haven't done an exhaustive count, but there's one paper that looks at 2,000 different outcomes. And there's no correction for statistical significance there or anything. And of course, they find lots that are really significant, and it's becoming a big deal. So what's happening really here is that this data mining turns large experiments into small experiments. And so we're really back to where we were before. And of course, it turns out they're not decisive either. Last problem I have with this, which is many policies take time to work out. And this is often really neglected. Lots of things, policies work as intended in the short run, and they fail later. Or they may not work in the short run, and they do work later. Part of it is that people learn to work the system, and that can either undermine the system or actually make it work. One example that I've read a bit about is food rationing in Britain during the war. It was excellent at first. There was a lot of social solidarity. There were big nutritional benefits. But then people who in Britain at that time were called spivs, and these were just basically crooks who learned to exploit the system and trade the rations and make a lot of money out of the ration system. And eventually, within a few years of the end of the war, support eventually vanished. And it's true that the scheme had been kept on too long. But a scheme that had sort of been a miracle of success within 7 or 8 years became a disaster. I know something about old age cash pensions in South Africa, where they had a sophisticated cash transfer system, including biometrics, fingerprinting. People had to come and put their fingers in an ATM machine, and that fingerprinted them, and if that was them, they got their cash transfer. The fingerprinting machines were temperature sensitive because they were worried about people cutting off each other's fingers and sticking them into the machine. And so you couldn't, once Granny was dead, you couldn't bring her thumb every week along to the thing. But what happened, so they're very careful, elaborate biometrics to make this work. But there was things that began to happen too. So I went to one of these pension sites where people walked to get their pensions, these cash payments. And these vans came and sat on the hilltop, and they had a ring of armed soldiers around to keep people out. And then around the outside of the perimeter, lots of traders and shopkeepers and so on set up stalls so that the pensioners could spend their cash just after they got it. But then I discovered there were people inside the fence who were not soldiers and who were not part of the thing. And it turned out they were people who were selling burial insurance, and somehow they bribed their way into the scheme and had prior access to these pensioners as soon as they got the money. That didn't happen on the first day. It probably took years before that got worked out. There were later stories about banks withholding payments, so people would go and get their pensions, and then the bank would say the money hasn't come in, it hasn't come in, it hasn't come in, so they'd get them, and someone was skimming it. Procurement and supply effects in food policy are things that would take a long time to work out. So if you do a randomized controlled trial on this, and let's say it works at the beginning, then once you do that, you stop the trial. And this is the same in a medical trial. You have to stop the trial because you have to extend the benefits for other people. If it's not working, you have to stop the trial because you're hurting people. And you never find out what's going to happen down the pipe. And it's unethical to try. And this, again, in medical trials has been a real problem. So if you think there's time issues in these things, a randomized controlled trial really can't give you the right answer. So the last part of my talk is about taking evidence to policy. So let's say all the problems I've been talking about have gone away. We've done a perfect evaluation. We have the result that on average, cash transfers make people happier than PDS. On average, dams increase poverty. On average, reducing open defecation improves child health and reduces mortality. Suppose they were all done perfectly. So the question is, what use can we make of these results? Remember, these are perfectly done now. There's no statistical problems. They're totally credible. They're large. All that's going on. So, should the Planning Commission ban new dams? Should the Ministry of Rural Development encourage better sanitation? Should we replace PDS by conditional cash transfers? Now, there's an immediate problem here, which is that dams don't work on average. Doesn't tell us anything about any individual dam. But if the ministry has to approve a dam, it's a dam, not the average dam. Now, if the study that shows on average dams cause poverty, we'll certainly enter into the discussion, but it's not a decisive consideration. Because once again, you're dealing with a specific thing. And even if that was in the study only tells you an average. The average is good to know, but it's not decisive. Think about a village or any local authority that wants to decide, given an RCT, about cash transfers versus the PDS. Again, the average is useful, but not decisive. Because in that village, you can imagine the village elders sitting around talking about this, and they said, will it have the average effect for us? Well, we're not the average village. Again, we need to know why it works, not whether it works. What happens if a neighboring village tried it and they're happy with the outcome? Now, perhaps that's just an anecdote. Usually that evidence is dismissed. It's sort of like, you know, your mother says your uncle was very happy with his new TV, therefore the good TVs. You know, this is just one village. But, you know, maybe the village next door is closer to your village in lots of ways than the average village. And for your village, the average outcome is just an anecdote too. Perhaps the village elders should go to the village next door and find out why it worked there, what was going on. And then they might be able to find out. They'll see immediately, this won't work for us. It works in that village because that village is peculiar in some way. So you can actually, if you observe the mechanism, then you can make policy. But you need to understand what's going on. So to me, finding out what works is not a randomized controlled trial. It's much more a process of trial and error. Trial and error is not the same as randomized controlled trial. It's what historians of the Industrial Revolution call endless tinkering. How to invent a steam engine or a toaster. If you think of the hip replacement, which I have here, those were developed by trial and error. People kept trying them out until they perfected it. And it was a huge amount